I'm writing this from a safe house somewhere in Alaska. At least, I hope it's safe. After what I witnessed at the facility, after what I became part of, I'm not sure anywhere is truly safe anymore. My name is Marcus Rivera. For 5 years, I was a correctional officer at ADX Florence in Colorado. Supermax security. The worst of the worst. I thought I'd seen everything humanity could produce in terms of evil. I was wrong. 3 months ago, Warden Phillips called me into his office on a Monday morning. The walk down that familiar hallway felt different, somehow. Like I was walking towards something that would change everything. "Close the door, Rivera," he said without looking up from the paperwork on his desk. That's when I knew I was either in serious trouble or about to be offered something that would complicate my life in ways I couldn't imagine. In corrections, those are usually the only 2 options. I sat down across from him and waited. Phillips was old school. 30 years in the system, worked his way up from guard to warden the hard way. He wasn't the type to waste time with pleasantries. "You're the best officer I have," he said finally. "Clean record, no complaints, no incidents. The inmates respect you because you're fair but firm. Your colleagues trust you because you don't play politics." I nodded, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. "I'm going to offer you something." Phillips continued. $600,000 for 1 year of work. Same benefits, less bureaucracy, leadership position. The number hit me like a physical blow. 600,000. That was more than I made in 5 years at Florence. My wife Sarah and I had been talking about starting a family, but the finances never seemed right. This kind of money would change everything. "What's the catch?" I asked. Phillips smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You'd be working at a classified facility, Arctic location. No communication with the outside world except through monitored mail. You tell your wife you're going to a federal training academy. 1 year, complete isolation." "What kind of facility?" "The kind that officially doesn't exist," he said. "The kind that handles problems the regular system can't deal with." I thought about Sarah, about the mortgage payments, the student loans, the dreams we'd put on hold because we couldn't afford them, about the possibility of finally having enough money to build the life we'd always talked about. If I say no, then this conversation never happened, and you go back to your regular duties. I looked at Phillips for a long moment, trying to read his expression. There was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not fear, exactly, but caution. Like a man who'd learned to be very careful about what he wished for. "I'll do it," I said. Phillips nodded slowly. "Report to Hangar 7 at Peterson Air Force Base tomorrow at 600 hours. Bring nothing but the clothes on your back. Everything else will be provided." As I walked back to my post, I wondered what I'd just signed up for. But $600,000 was $600,000. How bad could it be? I found out soon enough. The flight north took 8 hours. Military transport. No windows, no conversation with the crew. Just me and my thoughts as we flew over increasingly desolate terrain toward whatever waited for me in the Arctic. When we finally landed, the cold hit me like a physical wall, even with the heavy-duty gear they'd given me. And the air felt like it was trying to freeze my lungs from the inside. The landscape was nothing but white in every direction, broken only by the dark bulk of the facility rising from the ice like some ancient fortress. The House of Daemonium, they called it, though I wouldn't learn that name for several weeks. The compound was larger than I'd expected. 3 main buildings connected by covered walkways, surrounded by multiple perimeter fences topped with razor wire. Guard towers at each corner, though I noticed the guards seemed to be looking inward as much as outward. Warden Buckley met me at the main entrance. He was younger than Phillips, maybe 45, with the kind of hard edges that came from too many years dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. But there was something else about him, too. A wariness that went deeper than professional caution. "Rivera," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Welcome to Hell's Freezer." The intake process was thorough. Medical exam, psychological evaluation, background check verification. Standard procedure. except for the additional paperwork. Non-disclosure agreements that were thicker than some novels I'd read. Waivers that seemed to cover everything from radiation exposure to psychological trauma. What exactly am I agreeing not to disclose? I asked the administrative officer processing my paperwork. She was a thin woman in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that had seen too much. "Everything," she said simply. "Whatever you see here, whatever you hear, whatever you experience, none of it leaves this facility. Ever." My quarters were Spartan but functional. A small room with a single bed, desk, and locker. No television, no radio, no connection to the outside world. Just me and my thoughts, and the constant sound of wind howling across the ice. The first few days were orientation. Learning the layout, meeting the other guards, understanding the protocols. There were 23 of us on staff. Guards, medical personnel, maintenance crew, and administrative support. Everyone had the same look in their eyes that I'd seen in Buckley, like they'd seen things that had fundamentally changed their understanding of the world. It was during my first week that I noticed the peculiarities of the inmates. There were 47 prisoners in the facility. All male, all between the ages of 25 and 60, all with extensive scarring on their faces and arms. Burn-like marks that looked infected, but never seemed to heal. And they all spoke in that strange, guttural language. What's wrong with their skin? I asked Roberts, one of the senior guards who'd been assigned to show me the ropes. Roberts was a big man. Ex-military, with the kind of 1,000-yard stare that came from combat experience. But when he looked at the inmates, there was something else in his expression. Fear, maybe. Or respect. "Chemical burns," he said after a moment. "From before they got here." "What kind of chemicals?" "The kind you don't want to know about," Roberts said. "Trust me on that." The inmates themselves were unsettling, not just because of their appearance, but because of the way they carried themselves. There was an awareness about them that went beyond normal human perception, like they could see things the rest of us couldn't, and the sounds they made weren't quite language. They were deeper than that. Older, like voices speaking from the bottom of a well. My first real encounter with one of the inmates came during my second week. I was doing a routine cell check when I stopped in front of cell block C, Unit 15. No. The nameplate read, Christopher Alico. The cell door was solid metal with a small observation window. When I looked through it, I saw him sitting on his cot, staring directly at me. Peace. Like he'd been waiting. Alico was massive. At least 6'8", probably pushing 320, all of it muscle. His skin was crisscrossed with those same burn-like scars. And his eyes were wrong. Not the color, not the shape, but something deeper. Like looking into a well that had no bottom. "Officer Rivera," he said. Though I hadn't spoken or identified myself, his voice was deep, as I'd expected from a man his size. But there was something else underneath it. Like multiple voices speaking in perfect synchronization. "How do you know my name?" I asked. Alico smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too sharp. "I know many things about you. Marcus, I know about the convenience store in Denver when you were 17. The gun you carried even though you'd never fired it. The way your hands shook when you pointed at the clerk." My blood went cold. I had never told anyone about that night. Not Sarah, not the therapists I'd been required to see when I joined corrections. Not even the priest during my brief attempt at finding God after getting out of the gang life. "I know about the dreams you still have." Alico continued. "The ones where you pull the trigger, where you see the clerk's face explode in a shower of blood and bone. The way you wake up in a cold sweat. Wondering if somewhere, in some other version of reality, you became a killer that night." I backed away from the cell door, my heart pounding. How could he know? How could anyone know? "That's enough," I said, but my voice cracked. Alico laughed, and the sound echoed off the walls like it was coming from everywhere at once. I finished my rounds in a daze and went straight to Buckley's office, the inmate in C-15. I said, "Aluko, what's his story?" Buckley looked up from his paperwork with that expression I was getting used to seeing. Resignation mixed with something that might have been pity. "I can't tell you the details of any inmate's case," he said. "Classified information." He knew things about me. I said, "Things that no one should know." Buckley set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Rivera, you've been here less than 2 weeks. You're still adjusting. The isolation, the cold, the stress of a new assignment. It can make your mind play tricks on you." This wasn't my imagination. What did he say? Exactly. I told him about the convenience store, about the dreams. Buckley listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "Son of a bitch," he muttered when I finished. "What?" "Nothing. Just be careful around that one. Don't engage in conversation unless it's absolutely necessary for your duties. That's it. That's all you're going to tell me." Buckley stood up and walked to the window. Outside, snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, adding to the already substantial accumulation. "Rivera, there are things about this facility that you're not cleared to know yet. Things that would sound insane if I tried to explain them. But if you can handle what you're seeing now, if you can do your job without asking too many questions, then in a few months, maybe we'll have a different conversation. And if I can't handle it," Buckley turned back to me. "Nee." And for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw something approaching sympathy in his eyes. "Then we'll send you home with your memory modified and a story about a training accident that left you with some psychological trauma. You'll get a disability pension and never have to work another day in your life." Memory modified. Forget I said that. I left his office with more questions than answers. But I'd learned something important. Whatever was happening at this facility, it was big enough to justify mind-altering cover-ups. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into learning everything I could about the prison's operations. The daily routines, the security protocols, the medical procedures. Anything that might give me insight into what I was really dealing with. The medical bay was particularly interesting. Dr. Helen Vasquez was the chief medical officer, a woman in her early 40s who'd previously worked at a psychiatric hospital in California. She had that same look in her eyes that everyone else did, but hers was mixed with a kind of clinical fascination that made me nervous. "The inmates require specialized medical care," she told me during one of our conversations. "Their conditions are unique." "What kind of conditions?" "Systemic infections that don't respond to traditional antibiotics, neurological anomalies that affect their speech patterns, metabolic irregularities that require carefully controlled diets, and the scars." Dr. Vasquez paused in her review of a medical chart. "Those are pre-existing conditions, from their lives before incarceration." "What caused them?" "That's classified information, Officer Rivera." Everything was classified. The inmates' backgrounds, their crimes, their medical conditions, even the reason for the facility's existence. I was starting to feel like I was working in the dark, dealing with shadows and half-truths. But the money was real. Every month, exactly $50,000 appeared in my account. More money than I'd ever seen in my life, accumulating toward a total that would change everything for Sarah and me. "Why, I wrote to her regularly, carefully crafted letters that painted a picture of advanced correctional training and federal certifications. She wrote back with news from home, updates on our friends, plans for what we do when I return. "I miss you so much," she wrote in one letter. "This feels like the longest year of our lives, but I know you're doing something important, and I'm proud of you for taking on this challenge." If only she knew. The breakthrough came during my 6th week at the facility. I was working the night shift when alarms started blaring throughout the complex. Emergency lights bathed everything in red, and the intercoms crackled to life with Buckley's voice. "Code Black. All personnel to stations." Code Black. I had never heard of Code Black before. It wasn't in any of the manuals I'd been given. But the urgency in Buckley's voice was unmistakable. I grabbed my radio and equipment and headed toward the cell blocks. Other guards were moving with purpose, but there was an undercurrent of fear that I'd never seen in a correctional facility before. "What's Code Black?" I asked Roberts as we converged in the main corridor. "Possession event," he said grimly. "One of them is having an episode." "Possession?" Roberts looked at me like I was slow. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't a regular prison, Rivera. These aren't regular inmates." We reached cell block D, where a crowd of guards and medical personnel had gathered outside Unit 23. Through the observation window, I could see the inmate inside thrashing against his restraints on the bed. But it wasn't normal thrashing. His body was contorting in ways that seemed to defy anatomy, bending at angles that should have broken bones. And the sounds he was making, they weren't human. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "Won't help you here." Roberts said, "We need Father Lamora." As if summoned by his name, a priest appeared at the end of the corridor. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s, wearing traditional black robes with a white collar. He carried a leather satchel that looked ancient, worn smooth by decades of use. "How long has this been going on?" Father Lamora asked Dr. Vasquez. "About 20 minutes. It's getting worse." The priest nodded and began removing items from his satchel. A crucifix, a vial of water, a book bound in cracked leather. Other objects that I couldn't identify. "I need the room cleared except for essential personnel." Father Lamora said, "Dr. Vasquez, you and 2 guards, everyone else. Maintain the perimeter." Buckley appeared at my side. "You wanted to know what this place really is," he said quietly. "Now you're going to find out." Through the observation window, I watched as Father Lamora entered the cell. The inmate's reaction was immediate and violent. His thrashing increased, and a sound emerged from his throat that made my teeth ache. Not a scream, not a roar, but something that seemed to vibrate in frequencies human ears weren't designed to process. Father Lamora began to speak, not in English, but in Latin. The words were familiar from my Catholic childhood, but the context was something entirely different. This wasn't a simple prayer or blessing. This was combat. The inmate's body arched off the bed, held down only by reinforced restraints that looked strong enough to hold down a bear. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and that terrible sound continued to pour from his throat. I asked Buckley. "He's not alone in there." Buckley said, "There's something else with him, something that doesn't belong in our world." Father Lamora's voice rose, the Latin words coming faster and with more authority. He held the crucifix above the inmate's writhing form and began to sprinkle water from the vial. The reaction was immediate. The inmate's skin began to smoke where the water touched it, releasing a stench like burning sulfur. His body convulsed even more violently, and the sounds coming from his throat changed pitch, becoming higher, more desperate. And then, suddenly, silence. The inmate went completely still. His eyes rolled forward and focused on Father Lamora with an expression of pure, concentrated hatred. "You think your symbols have power here," the inmate said, but his voice was wrong. It was deeper than it should have been, with harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources. "You think your words can bind what has been free since before your God drew breath." "I think," Father Lamora said calmly, "that you don't belong in this vessel, and I think it's time for you to leave." What happened next defied everything I thought I knew about reality. The inmate began to levitate, not floating gently, but rising from the bed with violent jerks, as if invisible hands were pulling him upward. The restraints snapped like tissue paper, and he hung in the air above us, his body twisting in that same anatomically impossible way. Father Lamora never stopped his incantation, even as objects around the cell began to move on their own. The metal toilet rose from its mounting and crashed against the wall. The bed flipped over. Papers from Dr. Vasquez's clipboard scattered through the air like leaves in a hurricane. And through it all, the thing wearing the inmate's body laughed. "Do you know what he did?" the voice asked, speaking directly to me through the observation window. Do you know why Marcus Rivera is really here? I felt cold spread through my chest. What? He killed 3 people in that convenience store. The voice continued. Not in this reality, but in others. In the places where different choices were made. Those deaths echo across dimensions. Marcus, those sins stain your soul in ways your little prayer book never prepared you for. That's not possible. I whispered. Possibility is a human concept. The voice said, we deal in certainties, and the certainty is that you are a killer. Marcus Rivera, you always have been, in some worlds, you just haven't pulled the trigger yet. Father Lamora's voice reached a crescendo, and suddenly the inmate dropped to the floor like a marionette with cut strings. The supernatural wind in the cell ceased, and the only sound was heavy breathing from everyone involved. The priest knelt beside the inmate and checked his pulse. He's alive, he announced. And alone. Dr. Vasquez and the guards entered the cell to assess the situation, while the rest of us maintained our positions. But my mind was reeling from what I'd witnessed. That wasn't human. I said to Buckley, no. He agreed. It wasn't. What is this place? Buckley was quiet for a long moment, watching as the medical team worked to stabilize the inmate. Finally, he turned to me with that expression I'd seen so many times before. The look of someone about to share a burden that was too heavy to carry alone. Rivera, what would you say if I told you that some crimes are so terrible, so fundamentally wrong, that they create tears in reality itself? I'd say you were insane. 6 months ago, I would have said the same thing, but some acts of evil are so profound that they attract things from outside our world. Things that see human consciousness as a vehicle for their own agenda. You're talking about demons. I'm talking about entities that exist in dimensions parallel to ours. Entities that feed on human suffering and use human bodies as anchor points in our reality. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. And the inmates are people who committed acts so evil that they became possessed by these entities. Regular prisons can't hold them. Regular methods can't contain them. So they end up here, where we have the resources to keep them stable. Stable. We can't exorcise them completely. Buckley explained. The possessions are too integrated, too complete. But we can keep the entities from taking full control. We can maintain a balance that allows the human consciousness to remain dominant most of the time. That's why you need the priest. Father Lamora is one of only 12 people in the world trained for this kind of work. He's been studying demonic possession for 30 years. Without him, we'd just be warehousing monsters. I looked back at the cell, where the inmate was now sitting up and looking around in confusion. His eyes were normal again. Human. Whatever had been speaking through him was gone. At least for now. How long do you keep them here? Some respond to treatment and can eventually be released to secure psychiatric facilities. Others, Buckley shrugged, others are here for life. The entities inside them are too strong, too dangerous to ever risk letting back into the general population. And Aluko is special, Buckley said grimly. He's what we call a primary. The entity possessing him isn't just using his body as a host. It's using him as a conduit to communicate with other entities in other dimensions. That's how he knows things about you that he shouldn't know. Things about other versions of me. Exactly, in the multiverse theory. Every choice creates a branch. Every decision spawns alternate realities where different outcomes occur. Aluko's entity can see across those branches. It can access the memories and experiences of alternate versions of people it encounters. The implications hit me like a physical blow. So everything it's said about me killing people is true in other realities, in other versions of your life where you made different choices or where circumstances pushed you in different directions. I leaned against the wall, feeling suddenly dizzy. The idea that somewhere, in some other reality, I was a murderer was almost too much to process. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because you needed to see it to believe it, Buckley said. And because we're going to need your help with something bigger. What do you mean? Aluko isn't the only primary we have. There are 7 of them in total, spread across different cell blocks. And lately, they've been communicating with each other. How? We don't know, but Father Lamora thinks they're planning something. Some kind of coordinated escape attempt that would involve temporarily merging their possessing entities into a single, incredibly powerful force. What would happen if they succeeded? Buckley's expression darkened. If 7 primary-level entities merged into a single consciousness with access to multiple human hosts, it would be an apocalyptic event. Not just for this facility, but potentially for the entire world. So what do? We stop them, Buckley said simply, by any means necessary. Over the following weeks, I learned more about the true nature of the facility than I ever wanted to know. The House of Daemonium was part of a network of similar institutions around the world, all funded by various religious organizations and government agencies that had a vested interest in keeping certain types of evil contained. The Catholic Church provided the largest share of funding and personnel, but they weren't alone. Orthodox Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, and even some pagan organizations contributed resources and expertise when faced with genuine supernatural threats. Apparently, theological differences took a backseat to survival. Father Lamora became my guide into this hidden world of exorcists and demonologists. He was a fascinating man. Equally comfortable discussing particle physics and ancient grimoires. His approach to possession was part religious faith, part scientific methodology. Many people think of possession as a purely spiritual phenomenon, he explained during one of our sessions. But the reality is more complex. These entities exist in dimensions that overlap with ours at specific frequencies. They can only manifest in our reality under certain conditions and through specific types of human consciousness. What makes someone susceptible? Extreme trauma, usually combined with acts of profound evil. When a person commits certain types of crimes, particularly those involving the deliberate infliction of suffering, they create psychological wounds that these entities can exploit. Like doorways. Exactly. The human psyche has natural defenses against this kind of intrusion, but extreme evil acts can break down those defenses, creating vulnerabilities that entities can use to establish footholds in our dimension. I thought about my own near miss with violent crime. What if someone almost commits those acts but doesn't? Then they remain vulnerable but not necessarily compromised. Father Lamora said, "That's actually why you're able to work here effectively. You understand the psychology of potential violence without having crossed the line that would make you a target for possession." Aluko said I killed people in other realities. And he may be right. But in this reality, in this dimension, you made different choices. That's what matters for our purposes. The conversation was oddly comforting, but it also raised disturbing questions about the nature of choice and responsibility. If I was a killer in some other version of reality, did that make me inherently evil, or did it just make me human? With the capacity for both good and evil depending on circumstances. These philosophical questions became more pressing as we prepared for what Buckley called the consolidation event. The 7 primary inmates were showing increasing signs of coordination, speaking in synchronized patterns and displaying knowledge of each other's activities, despite being housed in separate cell blocks. It's like they're forming a hive mind. Dr. Vasquez reported during one of our strategy meetings, their brain patterns are starting to synchronize, even when they're physically separated. How is that possible? I asked. The entities possessing them exist partially outside our normal space-time. Father Lamora explained, distance as we understand it doesn't apply to them in the same way. They can maintain connections across physical barriers that would stop normal communication. So how do we prevent them from merging? We interrupt the connection. Father Lamora said, simultaneously perform containment rituals on all 7 inmates before they can complete whatever process they're attempting. And if we fail? Buckley answered that one. If we fail, we have 47 possessed inmates in a facility designed to hold maybe 20 under normal circumstances. The entity collective would be strong enough to break through our physical barriers and escape into the general population. What's the range of their influence? Unknown, but worst-case scenario. We're looking at a cascade effect where the merged entity begins possessing people in nearby communities, spreading outward until we have a regional epidemic of supernatural possession. The plan was complex and dangerous. We would need to coordinate simultaneous containment rituals across all 7 cell blocks, while maintaining normal security protocols for the other 40 inmates. Any mistake, any delay, could trigger the consolidation event we were trying to prevent. I was assigned to assist with Aluko's containment. Despite my relative inexperience with supernatural threats, Buckley felt that my psychological profile made me resistant to the entity's attempts at mental manipulation. He's already tried to break you down by revealing traumatic information, Buckley explained. Since that didn't work, he's less likely to be able to establish a psychological foothold. The night of the operation, I felt like I was preparing for war. Father Lamora had briefed me on the specific signs to watch for: changes in the inmate's voice, unusual physical movements, temperature fluctuations in the cell. If any of those occurred during the containment ritual, I was to immediately alert the medical team and prepare for emergency evacuation. Father Lamora said as we approached Aluko's cell, "The entity will try to distract us by targeting your personal fears and guilt. Don't listen to its words. Focus only on the ritual and your assigned duties. What if it tries to possess me? It can't." Father Lamora said confidently, "You haven't committed the necessary acts to make yourself vulnerable. The worst it can do is try to manipulate your emotions." We entered the cell to find Aluko sitting calmly on his bed, as if he'd been expecting us. His eyes were clear and human, but there was something in his expression that suggested awareness of our intentions. "Marcus," he said pleasantly, "and Father Lamora, here for another session." Something like that. Father Lamora replied as he began unpacking his ritual supplies. Aluko watched with apparent interest as the priest arranged crucifixes, candles, and vials of various substances around the cell. His demeanor was almost conversational, like we were old friends catching up. "You know this won't work," Aluko said. "What we're becoming is beyond your ability to contain." "We'll see about that," Father Lamora replied, beginning his Latin incantation. The change was immediate. Aluko's relaxed posture shifted into something more predatory, and his voice took on the multitonal quality I'd learned to associate with direct entity communication. "Marcus," the voice said, "Nah. Do you want to see what you become in the realities where you embrace your true nature?" Despite Father Lamora's warning, I found myself listening. The entity's voice had a hypnotic quality that was hard to ignore. In Reality Branch 7742 Alpha, you kill the convenience store clerk and spend 15 years in prison, where you murder 3 more inmates and become something truly magnificent. Father Lamora's chanting grew louder, but the entity's voice cut through it like a knife. In Reality Branch 9903 B-Day, you join the military and become a sniper in Iraq, where you discover a talent for killing that transcends mere war. I try to focus on my assigned tasks, monitoring the cell temperature, watching for signs of physical manifestation, but the images the entity was painting were vivid and disturbing. In Reality Branch 3421 Gamma, you become a serial killer who targets corrupt politicians, convincing yourself that you're serving justice while feeding an addiction to human suffering. "Stop listening to it," Father Lamora commanded without breaking his ritual cadence. But the entity wasn't finished. "Would you like to know the common thread across all these realities? Marcus, in every single one where you embrace your capacity for violence, you eventually find your way here, to this facility, to us." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" "Every version of you that becomes a killer eventually commits acts evil enough to attract our attention. Every version of you that crosses that line becomes a vessel for entities like us. In a very real sense. Marcus Rivera, you were always destined to be here. The only variable is which side of the bars you end up on." The temperature in the cell plummeted suddenly, and frost began forming on the walls. Father Lamora's breath was visible as vapor, but he continued his incantation without pause. Aluko's body began to contort, muscles bunching and stretching in ways that should have been impossible, but his eyes remained fixed on me. And his voice continued speaking with that unsettling multi-tonal quality. "You feel it, don't you? The hunger? The curiosity about what it would feel like to cross that final line? That's why you're really here, Marcus. Not for the money, not for your wife. You're here because part of you recognizes kindred spirits in us." I wanted to deny it, but there was a grain of truth in the entity's words that made my stomach clench. I had wondered, sometimes, in my darkest moments, what it would have felt like to pull that trigger in the convenience store. What kind of person I might have become if I'd made that choice. Father Lamora's ritual reached a crescendo, and suddenly the supernatural cold in the cell broke like a fever. Aluko's body relaxed back into normal human proportions, and his eyes cleared. "Did it work?" I asked. Father Lamora was checking readings on several electronic devices I didn't recognize. "For now. The connection has been severed temporarily, but we need to move to the next phase before it can re-establish contact with the other entities." We moved through the facility methodically, assisting with containment rituals in each of the primary cells. The process was exhausting and terrifying. Each entity had its own method of psychological attack, its own way of trying to break down our mental defenses. The entity in cell block B tried to convince me that Sarah was having an affair back home, showing me vivid mental images of her with another man. The entity in cell block E attempted to make me believe that the entire facility was a government experiment, and that I was actually the test subject. The entity in cell block F tried to persuade me that I had already died, and that everything I was experiencing was some form of purgatory. But Father Lamora had prepared me for these attacks. I focused on the rituals, on my assigned duties, on the concrete reality of what we were trying to accomplish. By dawn, we had successfully interrupted the consolidation process. The 7 primary inmates were isolated and contained, their possessing entities temporarily cut off from each other. "Is it over?" I asked as we gathered in the break room for coffee and exhausted debriefing. "For now," Buckley said, "but this kind of containment is temporary. The entities will eventually find ways to re-establish contact. We've bought ourselves time, but we haven't solved the fundamental problem, which is, we're trying to contain forces that exist partially outside our reality using methods that are entirely within our reality. It's like trying to hold water with a net." Father Lamora nodded grimly. "The Church has been studying this problem for decades. Traditional exorcism can expel entities from individual hosts, but it can't prevent them from finding new hosts. And when you're dealing with primary-level entities, the risk of cascade possession is too high to attempt standard exorcism. So what's the long-term solution?" "There isn't one," Dr. Vasquez said flatly. "We're essentially warehousing a supernatural problem that we don't fully understand and can't permanently solve. It's containment, not cure." The reality of our situation settled over me like a lead blanket. We were guards in a prison that held forces beyond human comprehension, using methods that were temporary at best, fighting a battle that had no clear victory condition. But the alternative, allowing these entities to escape into the general population, was unthinkable. Over the remaining months of my assignment, I settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible when I first arrived. Daily containment checks, weekly psychological evaluations, monthly ritual renewals. It became normal to speak with possessed inmates, to witness supernatural phenomena, to participate in exorcisms that would have been the stuff of horror movies in my previous life. But normal doesn't mean comfortable. Every day brought new challenges, new reminders of how little we actually understood about what we were dealing with. 3 months after the consolidation event, we received a new inmate. His name was David Kowalski, a former accountant from Milwaukee, who had murdered his entire family in a ritualistic fashion that suggested supernatural influence. The crime scene photos showed symbols carved into the walls that Father Lamora recognized from medieval grimoires. Kowalski was different from our other inmates. Where they showed signs of ongoing possession, the scarring, the strange vocalizations, the unnatural awareness, he seemed almost normal. Polite, articulate, genuinely remorseful about his crimes. "I don't remember doing it," he told me during his intake interview. "I remember being at home with my wife and kids, having dinner. Then I remember waking up covered in blood with police breaking down my door. Everything in between is just gone." "Have you experienced any unusual symptoms since then?" I asked, following the standard intake protocol. Strange dreams, voices, periods of missing time. Nothing like that. Kowalski said, just the guilt. The knowledge that somehow I killed the people I loved more than anything in the world. Dr. Vasquez ran him through the full battery of tests we used to detect supernatural influence. Brain scans, blood work, psychological evaluations. Even some experimental procedures that Father Lamora had developed to detect dimensional interference. Everything came back normal. It's possible he was possessed temporarily and then abandoned by the entity. Father Lamora explained, some lower-level entities use humans for specific tasks and then move on, leaving the host with no memory of the possession. So why is he here instead of a regular prison? Because the ritual nature of his crime suggests involvement with entities we haven't identified yet. Until we're certain he's not still compromised, he needs to remain in containment. But Kowalski's presence disturbed the other inmates in ways we hadn't anticipated. The primaries became agitated, speaking in their guttural language more frequently. The non-primary inmates showed signs of increased supernatural activity. More episodes requiring intervention, more attempts at self-harm, more reports of nightmares and hallucinations. It's like he's some kind of catalyst. Dr. Vasquez observed. His presence is amplifying the supernatural activity throughout the facility. The situation came to a head during my 10th month at the facility. I was doing a routine night check when I found Kowalski's cell empty. Not escaped. Empty in a way that defied physics. The door was still locked. The walls were intact, but David Kowalski was simply gone. No trace, no sign of where he might have gone or how he might have left. Within minutes, alarms were blaring throughout the facility. Emergency protocols engaged automatically, sealing all exits and entrances. But it was too late. The other inmates were going berserk. All 46 of them, simultaneously. Screaming, thrashing, speaking in that same guttural language. But now the language sounded different. Coordinated. Like a massive choir performing some unholy symphony. They're all connected now, Father Lamora said as we gathered in the security center, watching multiple screens showing chaos throughout the cell blocks. Whatever entity was using Kowalski, it's used his disappearance to establish connections with all the others. How is that possible? Kowalski was a conduit. Father Lamora explained grimly. The entity possessing him was using his presence here to study our containment methods and map the supernatural signatures of our other inmates. When it had learned what it needed, it simply collected its asset and activated a network we didn't know existed. On the screens, we watched as cell doors began to open on their own. Not all at once, but in a careful sequence that suggested intelligence and planning. The entities were coordinating a mass breakout, lockdown protocol. Buckley ordered over the facility intercom. All personnel to defensive positions. This is not a drill. But our defensive positions had been designed to deal with human inmates, not supernatural entities with the ability to manipulate physical reality. As I watched the screens, I saw inmates walking through solid walls, cell bars bending like rubber, electronic locks shorting out in showers of sparks. We need to evacuate. Dr. Vasquez said, get to the emergency bunker and call for backup. There is no backup. Buckley replied, we're the backup. If we can't contain this, it spreads to the outside world. Father Lamora was already gathering his ritual supplies. There's one option, he said, but it's extremely dangerous and likely to be fatal for whoever attempts it. What option? A mass banishment ritual. Instead of trying to contain the entities individual, we attempt to sever all their connections to this dimension simultaneously, force them back to whatever realm they came from. What's the catch? The ritual requires a willing sacrifice. Someone has to serve as an anchor point for the banishment, maintaining the ritual circle while the entities try to destroy them. The psychic backlash alone would be enough to kill most people. And if the ritual fails, we become vessels for 46 primary level entities. Buckley finished. The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in red light. But in that brief moment of darkness, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps in the hallway outside the security center. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with purpose. I said, through the reinforced glass of the security center. We could see them, our former inmates, but changed. They moved with perfect coordination, like parts of a single organism. Their scarred faces showed no individual expression, only collective intelligence. And leading them was Aluko. He stopped directly in front of our position and smiled. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics from all 46 entities. Marcus Rivera. The collective voice said, "We've been waiting for you to understand." Understand what? That you were never here to guard us. You were here to join us. Every reality where you embrace violence leads to the same conclusion. Every version of you that crosses that line eventually becomes one of us. I didn't cross any lines. Not yet. The collective agreed, but you will, tonight. Father Lamora stepped forward with his ritual supplies. I can begin the banishment ritual now, but I'll need someone to maintain the circle while I perform the primary incantation. I'll do it. I said, "Marcus, you don't understand the risks." I understand them. I interrupted, and I understand something else. That thing out there is right about one thing. Every choice I've made in my life has led me to this moment. This facility, this situation, this choice. Maybe in other realities I become a monster, but in this one, right now, I choose to be something else. Buckley handed me a sidearm. If the ritual fails, don't let them take you alive. A possessed Marcus Rivera would be catastrophic. Understood. Father Lamora began arranging ritual components in a complex pattern on the floor of the security center. Candles, crystals, vials of blessed substances. Symbols drawn in what looked like ash but smelled like sulfur. When I begin the incantation, you need to stand in the center of the circle and maintain physical contact with this, he said, handing me a silver pendant covered in inscriptions I couldn't read. No matter what happens, no matter what they try to make you see or feel, don't let go of the pendant and don't step outside the circle. What will happen to me? If we're successful, the psychic backlash will likely kill you instantly. If we fail, Father Lamora didn't finish the sentence. If we fail, I become something worse than dead. Yes. I took the pendant and stepped into the center of the ritual circle. Through the glass, I could see the possessed inmates arranging themselves in their own pattern, forming geometric shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly. They're preparing a counter-ritual, Father Lamora observed. We need to move quickly. He began the banishment incantation in Latin, but this was different from the containment rituals I'd witnessed before. The words seemed to carry physical weight, pressing down on everything in the room. The air itself became thick and difficult to breathe. The reaction from the entities was immediate and violent. The reinforced glass separating us from the hallway began to crack. Not from physical impact, but from some kind of dimensional pressure that made reality itself unstable. Through the growing cracks, I could see the possessed inmates writhing and contorting as their entities fought against the banishment. But they were also fighting back. Pain exploded through my skull as 46 supernatural intelligences focused their attention on me. Not physical pain, but something deeper. They were trying to tear my consciousness apart at the molecular level. Images flooded my mind. Every violent impulse I'd ever suppressed, every dark thought I'd ever entertained, every moment in my life when I'd chosen restraint over action. The entities were showing me what I could become if I just let go of my humanity. You could be so much more. Their collective voice whispered in my head. You could transcend these petty human limitations. You could become a force of nature. The pendant in my hand grew burning hot, but I held on. Father Lamora's voice continued the banishment ritual, but I could hear strain creeping into his words. Look at your life, Marcus. A prison guard making $30,000 a year. Married to a woman who doesn't understand you. Living in a world that doesn't appreciate your potential. Is this really worth protecting? I thought about Sarah waiting for me at home. About the letters she sent describing her plans for our future together. About the life we'd build with the money I was earning here. She's with someone else right now. The voices continued. While you're here risking your life for people who see you as expendable, she's in bed with your neighbor. She's been planning to leave you since you took this assignment." The images they showed me were vivid and convincing. Sarah in another man's arms, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate me into taking a dangerous job far from home. But something Father Lamora had taught me about entity manipulation came back to me. When Grace, they could show you alternate realities, but they couldn't show you your actual reality unless they had direct access to it. These images, no matter how convincing, were designed to break down my will to resist. "Nice try." I said it out loud. The collective voice snarled in frustration, and the psychic assault intensified. But I held onto the pendant and stayed within the ritual circle. Father Lamora's incantation reached a crescendo, and suddenly the entire facility shook like it was caught in an earthquake. But this wasn't seismic activity. This was dimensional instability as the banishment ritual began to take effect. The possessed inmates outside began to scream in harmonious agony as their entities were forcibly separated from their host bodies. One by one, I watched them collapse to the floor, twitching and convulsing as supernatural forces were torn from their consciousness. But the psychic backlash was overwhelming. I felt like my brain was being turned inside out, every neuron firing at once in patterns that human nervous systems weren't designed to handle. Blood began pouring from my nose. My vision blurred and doubled. The pendant in my hand felt like it was fusing with my palm. Last chance. Marcus. The fading collective voice whispered, "Join us willingly, and we'll make your transition painless. Go to hell," I managed to say through gritted teeth. The final phase of the banishment ritual activated like a bomb going off inside my skull. Every entity in the facility was simultaneously severed from our dimension and cast back into whatever realm they'd come from. The last thing I remember was the sound of 46 human voices screaming in perfect unison as they were suddenly, violently, alone in their own minds again. Then everything went black. I woke up 3 weeks later in a military hospital in Anchorage. The doctors told me I'd suffered massive psychological trauma, the kind usually associated with severe torture or extended sensory deprivation. They were amazed I was still sane, if I still was sane. The official story was that there had been a gas leak at the training facility where I'd been stationed. Hallucinogenic compounds in the ventilation system had caused mass psychosis among the staff and trainees. I was the sole survivor, found unconscious in a sealed room that had somehow avoided contamination. I was given a full medical discharge with psychological disability benefits. Enough money to never work again, if I chose not to. All I had to do was sign some paperwork acknowledging that the gas leak incident was classified and could never be discussed with anyone. I signed. Sarah was waiting for me when I returned to Colorado. She was exactly as I'd left her, loving, supportive, completely unaware of what I'd actually been through. The entity's visions of her infidelity had been lies, designed to break my will to resist. But even knowing that, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I was living in the wrong reality. That somewhere, in some other dimension, a version of me had made different choices and become something monstrous. The dreams started a few months after my return. Not nightmares, exactly, but vivid dreams of other lives, other versions of myself. Dreams where I pulled the trigger in that convenience store, where I joined the military and discovered a talent for killing, where I became the kind of person who ends up in facilities like the House of Daemonium. Dr. Peterson, the therapist the government provided, said the dreams were a normal part of processing trauma, that my mind was working through alternate scenarios as a way of making sense of what I'd experienced. He was probably right, but sometimes, when I caught my reflection in a mirror or a window, I thought I saw something else looking back, something that remembered what it felt like to be connected to 46 other supernatural intelligences, something that missed that connection. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've been researching other facilities like the House of Daemonium, trying to understand what happened to me. Yes, what I was part of, what the long-term consequences might be. What I've found is disturbing. There are 17 similar facilities around the world, all dealing with supernatural threats that governments can't officially acknowledge. And according to the encrypted communications I've managed to intercept, they're all reporting the same thing. Increased supernatural activity, more possessions, more entities crossing into our dimension, more people committing acts evil enough to attract supernatural attention. It's like the banishment ritual at the House of Daemonium didn't just send those entities back where they came from. It sent them back with information about our world, our defenses, our methods of containment. We won the battle, but we may have lost the war. And sometimes, late at night when Sarah is sleeping beside me, I feel something stirring in the back of my mind. A presence that wasn't there before my time in the Arctic. Something that learned to hide itself during the banishment ritual, that went dormant until it was safe to resurface. I think one of them is still with me. Not possessing me. Not controlling me. But observing, learning, waiting for the right moment to fully manifest. The money in my bank account is real. My disability benefits are real. My medical records are real. But everything else about my return to normal life feels like an elaborate performance. Like I'm playing the role of Marcus Rivera, loving husband and trauma survivor, while something else watches from behind my eyes. I'm writing this account as a warning and as a confession. If you're reading this, it means something has happened to me. Either I've been found dead under mysterious circumstances, or I've disappeared entirely, or I've done something terrible that's made the news. If any of those things have occurred, remember what I've told you about the House of Daemonium. Remember that there are forces in this world that most people can't even imagine, and that sometimes the people we trust to contain those forces aren't entirely human anymore. And if you're someone who works in corrections, someone who thinks they've seen the worst that humanity can produce, think very carefully before accepting any unusual job offers. Some prisons aren't designed to keep the inmates in. They're designed to keep something else out. Something that's been waiting a very long time for the barriers between dimensions to weaken enough for it to cross over permanently. The House of Daemonium was just the beginning. I can feel them coming. All of them. And this time, they won't need human hosts to anchor themselves in our reality. This time, they're coming to stay. Sarah is calling me for dinner. She's made my favorite meal, the same meal she made the night before I left for the Arctic. She does this sometimes when she's worried about me. Tries to recreate moments from before my accident. She has no idea that the man who went to that facility isn't the same man who came back. I need to go now. I need to pretend to be Marcus Rivera for a few more hours. But if you're reading this, remember what I've told you. Remember that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. And remember that sometimes the real horror isn't what's locked up in the prison. It's what the prison creates in the people who work there.